Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled today to welcome Martha Jones and her book, The Trouble of Color, An American Family Memoir. Just a couple quick reminders. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A feature and we'll be asking questions submitted by the audience in the second half of the program. And we'd like to thank our viewers for their continued support of Book Breaks. And I'm your host, Gina Oppenheim, and I'm joined by my friend Ryan, who will be taking your questions in the second half. And without further ado, we are so thrilled to welcome back our friend Martha Jones, who is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. She's the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, and Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. Welcome, Martha. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Gina. And hi, Ryan. It's great to be with you all again.
Now, just starting us off, can you give us an overview of the Trouble of Color and how it came to be?
Sure. This book is a departure for me. Some folks will know me from my work on more conventional histories, but this is a book that, in a sense, turns the historical lens on me and on my own family to ask a set of questions about the history of race and color in U.S. history, to think about the nature of the American family, and to think critically, as I hope we'll talk about, with some of the sources that we often use, both in family history, but also in social history and political history as well. But it really is a story that begins at the start of the 19th century in the era of enslavement, with families that are marked by sexual violence, and then asks how that history gets expressed across time in everything from contending with anti-miscegenation laws to questions about freedom and citizenship, to colorism and passing, and on through my own parents' generation, the generation I think of as the civil rights generation, for whom questions about race and color and the possibility for their lives are again transformed. The takeaway, I think, there are lots of them, but I think one of them is about family storytelling and about how in each generation, families like mine, but I suspect like many of our families, in each generation, families tell the stories they can tell, the stories they need to tell. In my story about race and about color and what it means. And I became fascinated with how those stories changed over time, even in my own lifetime. And so I try and capture that complexity and that kind of change in the course of these chapters.
You absolutely do beautifully. And I just wanted to start by asking about the opening scene of the book and why you decided to start where you started.
Yeah, briefly, the book begins with me as a first year in college, in a Black Studies classroom, making a presentation nervously, and being challenged by a classmate who I think observes my color, but my features, my demeanor, perhaps the cadence of my voice, and interrupts my presentation to, in essence, challenge whether or not I belong in a Black Studies classroom at all. It's a moment that, well, has stayed with me, clearly, so much so that I've come back to it all these years later. But it's an important question for the book, because, in essence, he asks, who do you think you are? And it turns out that's not an easy question to answer when you are someone whose appearance confounds conventional ideas about race and color in America, really challenges stereotypes or generalizations. So it has taken me this long to find an answer to him, and that answer was family. If you want to really understand who I am and what I'm doing there in the Black Studies classroom, I need to tell you this much longer story about my family.
Yes. What complications did you initially discover in researching your earliest ancestor, Nancy Bell Graves?
Yeah, thank you. The book begins with Nancy Bell Graves, and I find her photograph among, you know, a cache of photographs that are stuffed into an old manila envelope, and I finally take them out and I realize, as best I can tell, she seems to be the earliest ancestor among the photographs that we have. Turns out she was born in 1808 in Danville, Kentucky, enslaved, but lived until the 1880s, through enslavement, Civil War, Reconstruction, and more. And there were small bits of her story that had survived and been passed down to me. But I think the dilemma that I face, and I think you're alluding to, is that um, I'm not sure that I want to go the next step, which is to um, turn to the papers of the man who had enslaved Nancy um, up through the Civil War, and emancipation. I had a lot of ambivalence about relying upon the kinds of materials produced by people who certainly didn't have Nancy's interests or perspective in mind, and who really weren't ever intending, even when they kept meticulous records, to help someone like me unravel the puzzle of who we had been as a family.
Yeah. And in that same vein, can you tell us about Elijah and Mary Jones? Because they were such fascinating figures as well.
Right. So if Nancy Bell Graves stands in for the branch of my family with origins in Kentucky, Elijah and Mary are from central North Carolina, from the Piedmont, in a place called Little Texas. Um, they, in their own way, confront the color line when they decide to marry. Mary is a so-called white woman, and Elijah is a man of color. North Carolina state law, as is true in many places, prohibits their marriage. And I learn how, in essence, they use their skin and the ambiguities of color in the 1820s to trick the eyes of the court clerk, later on to deceive the census taker, to, in essence, pass themselves and ultimately their children off as all free people of color, as a way of staying together. If Nancy Bell Graves' story is one that is really rooted in our histories of slavery and sexual violence, and we can think of that as one disturbing and damaging confrontation with the color line. Elijah and Mary show us something about how people, even in the same era, are crossing the color line to make choices and to affirmatively make families for themselves.
Yeah. And were you aware of these stories when you were growing up?
I would say for the most part, no. My family is not so different, I think, than a lot of families in that we do tell stories about ancestors. Um, we tell, I think, like the same half dozen stories over and over at every occasion. And so I knew who some of these characters were, um, but I had also inherited stories that, how do I want to put it, that told the story differently than I ultimately tell it. And what I mean by that is that, for example, I have my grandfather's generations, the stories were often told in ways that elided the history of slavery altogether and the fact of enslavement altogether. Um, and it's not very challenging for us, when we use materials like the census and more to know more about those stories. But I had to think with what it meant to rewrite the story, I had to think with and try and understand why people told stories in the 1950s, for example, that elided um, histories that were certainly known, right, in an oral sense, but they weren't written down. And it helped me appreciate, in a sense, how for Black Americans, family storytelling has gone through a transformation in the 20th century, such that today we're not, or at least less reluctant to talk about the enslaved people in our family past, even if in earlier generations, folks had been more guarded about that.
Yeah. And were there any particular individuals whose stories might have ended up differently than you initially thought they would?
Yeah, so I'll say that on my grandfather's side in North Carolina, I had inherited a story about a woman named Isabella. Isabella was my grandfather's grandmother, and she was told to us, her story was told to us as if she had been a free woman. It was told to us um, in a way that included a man who had fathered her children, to whom she was not married, was the way we understood the story. And I might have retold that same story if it wasn't for a cousin. And, oftentimes family history is um, part of a collective project. And I have cousins who have been great collaborators in this work. And I had a cousin who was very eager when the papers of the Federal Freedmen's Bureau were finally released and digitized. And she found Isabella in the papers of the Freedmen's Bureau. That's the first thing, a contradiction, right, with the story we had inherited. But then she finds a document from Isabella in which Isabella is claiming um, the the terms of a deal she had made with the man who was the father of her children. They had made a bargain at the end of the Civil War. He was going to support them if they relocated to the city of Greensboro. But critical in there is that Isabella tells us, of course, that the man who was the father of her children was also the man who called her property. And this, as I said, was not a part of the story we had that had been passed down. But there was Isabella herself um, with, at great personal, with great courage, right, telling that story. And my view was if she could tell that story back in 1867, I could find a way to tell it also as she had told it.
Absolutely. And another favorite figure in the book of mine was your Aunt Fanny. Can you tell us about her experiences passing in St. Louis?
Yeah, so now we're in the 20th century, and Fannie Williams is born in 1862 or 63, born enslaved, but of course emancipated with the 13th Amendment. She's educated. She attends college at Berea College in Kentucky and spends most of her adult life as an educator and the wife of an educator in St. Louis, Missouri. Fanny has the sort of skin that can trick the eye. And she is someone who, from time to time, when it suits her, when it pleases her, I learn, does just that. That means that when she wants to occupy a preferred seat in a theater, or she wants to try on a dress in a department store, Fanny is willing to deceive, ticket sellers and department store clerks. And for her, while she goes home every night to Black St. Louis and remains a part of that community all of her life, she has an extended family, all of whom identify as Black. It's not that she's passed over into some other life, But she understands it, I think, as many Black Americans did in the early 20th century. They understood passing in part to be a way to thumb their noses at Jim Crow, to defy the strictures of segregation that were so much a part of the structures of their lives. And Fanny was, in that sense, a trickster who used her fair skin from time to time to, in her view, get the better of Jim Crow.
Yeah, and can you tell us a little more how family heirlooms helped you tell this story?
Sure. Um, uh, you know, it for me, it turned out um, while was able to work in some cases from surviving letters, correspondence, from of course, public records like census returns and birth and death certificates. I was able to work to some degree from oral histories, um, and of course, always from recollections that had been passed down. It was also true that I was willing to work with, the material culture that had been passed to me. Um, and while objects don't always tell their whole story, it's true that in Fanny's case, I inherit a piece of jewelry from her, and learn from her daughter, who passes on the necklace, that she believes, that there's a direct connection between me and Fanny. And I'm not only, I'm flattered by that on the one hand, but I also appreciate that there's a challenge in that, which is to say, um, am I like Fanny? Which is to say, do I also use my own skin to trick the eye, to pass in my own way? And so this is how the book becomes one part of family history and another part of memoir, because in those kinds of moments, I want to invite readers not only to appreciate Fanny as a character, I want to invite a conversation about what it's like for me and for those of us who inherit Fanny's legacy that includes her skin, and how in the 21st century, that's a very different kind of life than it might have been, than it was for her in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah, amazing. Well, you alluded to a few, but I was wondering if you could tell us about some of your favorite discoveries in your research.
Gosh. Um, I'll go back to Nancy Bell Graves, whom you mentioned at the top of the conversation. Um, and Nancy, another figure who I'm able to find in her photograph, and in the memories of her that are passed down. I'm able to find she's a member of, for a short time, of a Presbyterian church in Danville, Kentucky, where she is born and where she lives. And even as an enslaved woman, when she joins the congregation at First Presbyterian in Danville, Kentucky, the church clerk makes a record of her baptism, right, and her formal entry. So I have little snippets of her life, but I do eventually go to the records of the man who had last called her property. He was himself a college professor and later a college president there in Danville, and he kept meticulous ledgers, which have survived because, of course, his material has always been much valued by the college that with which he was affiliated. I had first asked an archivist to help me from a distance take a look at the records. Did he think there was anything about my family there? And his answer had been no. And it just never, um, I don't know if others have had this experience. You just have a hunch that there's something there, even when someone is telling you, no, they've taken a look. And so it takes me a long time, 10 years, to go myself to Danville and to go through these papers. And I discover not only has this this man kept a record of the former slaves that had been part of his family. He had kept a record of Nancy, her husband, her children, as in the post-war period, they variously worked for him, borrowed money from him, and more. But there's one page that really changes everything I think I know about Nancy when I come on a page titled Betty. It's Betty with colored in parentheses. And he recounts Betty after the war. By 1867, she becomes ill, and he records fronting funds for the physician, fronting funds for medicine. Betty passes away.
Sorry, I think we just have a slight technical difficulty. Um, Hopefully, we will get back on track in one moment. Oh, there we go. You're back again. You just unmute.
So sorry, folks. Um, so I'm not sure where I was, but
Yeah, go back. And we always say on book breaks, it's like live theater.
it
Things
is like live
happen.
theater. My God, I don't think that's ever happened to me before. So thank you for your patience as the Zoom got back up to speed. Um, so what I'm discovering, is that a story or a facet of Nancy's life that was not part of our family lore, that never appeared forthrightly on a census return or a death certificate. Now I realize that she had family. That not only was she part, of course, as she was part of a slaveholding household, had her own man whom she marries after the war and her own children, but all her life she had these sisters, Tina and Betty. And this for me is like it's like turning on a light bulb when we're able to fill out the layers of someone's life and to appreciate how extraordinary it was, certainly in her life, but in the lives of so many enslaved people when they were able to remain proximate to one another, to reconstitute their families after emancipation, to care for one another at difficult moments, such as during illness and death. That was a whole facet of her world that only time in those troubled records of a slaveholder I was able to discover. Um, yeah.
Well, what advice would you give to people on the call who might be interested in looking at their own family lineage?
I'll say just a few things. The first is to be patient with yourself. You're likely, when you do make discoveries, you're very likely to discover, as I did, things you didn't anticipate, to wander into parts of our past that are very challenging to sit with and to in any way reconcile, right? And Nancy's story is certainly one of those. And so, as I said, it takes me a long time before I'm willing to look at the records of a slaveholder and try and see her from his point of view. And I think it's okay to be reluctant, to be patient, to pace yourself, and to sit with the things that are challenging for you. I wrote this book alongside other family storytellers, and that to me was a great balm. Um, and sometimes those were, living, breathing historians who were also writing. But I also did a lot of reading. For Nancy's story, for example, a book like Harriet Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, really helped me to fill out my sense of what Nancy's world was like, what her life was like. And so it's so important to bring into your process other storytellers from the present, but also from the past, who are able to really help us make sense of um, and frame well what it is that we're finding. Yeah,
Oh, yeah. So I was going to say we started with the Joneses, the couple, and then at the end of the book, you cover your parents. Can you just explain why that's sort of a full circle moment when you then discuss your parents' marriage?
sure. So we've introduced Elijah and Mary, who, despite anti-miscegenation laws, marry in 1827 and live a long life together. Um, Well, my own parents in 1957, so that's 130 years later, um, also defy anti-miscegenation laws and marry across the color line. Um, and this for me was a kind of revelation to see those two stories as companion stories, because I had been raised uh, to a significant degree to think of my parents' marriage as aberrant, as outside the bounds of what is ordinary or normal in the American story. And certainly many people spoke of them by those terms. But discovering Mary and Elijah and many people like them in North Carolina at the beginning of the 19th century um, really helped me to understand that um, our stories, and I say our stories because one of the things that I've learned by the opportunity to talk to so many people about this book is I've learned how many of us, when we scratch the surface, when we get away from those six stories that we tell over and over again, so many of us come from families whose histories are not like the great stately oak tree with, you know, grand branches that spread out symmetrically, no, most of us come from families with very complicated pasts, crossing lines, yes, of race and color, lines of faith, lines of culture and language and national origin. And that it turns out the kind of family that I come from is much closer to the center, I think, of the American story. And Mary and Elijah really helped me be courageous about that possibility that we weren't so aberrant, even if law and culture and politics and more had suppressed those stories, that I was telling a story in the 21st century and need not be constrained by the kinds of forces that had constrained them and that had maligned my own parents.
Wow. And that feels like an amazing place to pass you over to Ryan, who's going to start with our
Sure.
scholar question of the week. Thank you so much for that amazing back and forth.
Thank you so much, Gina. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina. You said it for that amazing back and forth. For folks who are newer to the program, we always begin this part of the session with our History Student Scholar question of the week. This is the History Student Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests a question for a chance for themselves and their teacher to win a $50 gift card. Questions are always really great and strong, and this week is no exception. Our winner is Mia. I hope I said that right, Maia, who is in Mr. Loyola's class in High Point Regional High School in New Jersey. And the question is this. Could you provide some insight on the extent to which the civil rights era in the 1960s and 70s and the subsequent resurgence of some conservative values in the 80s and early 90s influenced the rights of interracial families and multiracial children?
Yeah, thank you very much. Um, Many folks will know of the U.S. Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia, 1967. The U.S. Supreme Court strikes down as unconstitutional the so-called anti-miscegenation laws that persist in I think 15 or 16 states in 1967. And so that is one watershed moment, I think, that really legitimates, recognizes, makes legible so-called interracial families going forward. It comes late, doesn't it? Because we associate sort of the constitutional undoing of Jim Crow with 1954 and Brown v. Board of Education, but we get a sense of how thorny and how durable anti-miscegenation laws were, that they persist long after Brown has been decided. I guess I would fast forward in a way to, the 1990s, when we have a movement that emerges, much of which focuses on the US Census and the boxes on the US Census, and a movement among multiracial Americans and the parents of multiracial children who look to shift the terms by which we respond to the US Census, and we get finally the opportunity to check more than one box. Now, this is a kind of recognition of the children of Loving versus Virginia by the US Census. And those numbers, I think it's 3 million the first year, 9 million the next, and in the most recent census, something like 30 million respondents. And that might sound like both an explosion and an actualization, I think, for interracial families and mixed race Americans. But maybe some folks followed a closer look at the 2020 census, and what we learn when a team of social scientists sort of looks with a skeptical eye at those numbers and discovers that there's been an algorithmic error introduced into the analysis of the 2020 census, such that many more people are counted as so-called mixed race than actually responded to the questions as mixed race. Why do I share that last bit? I think I share it because I think that there's a tension that I try to hold on to in the book between the realms of kind of official and state level storytelling, whether it's in a Supreme Court decision or it's in the every 10 years of the US Census, to put those kinds of stories about our families into tension with the stories that we might tell about ourselves. And I mentioned earlier, Mary and Elijah, well, they tricked the census taker, and the census taker every year marks Mary as free woman of color, or later M for mulatto. And so I think that there's an element of skepticism that we should bring as family historians to materials like the census, because likely our family stories contain a great deal more subtlety, more nuance, and maybe even dimensions that are not reflected in the official documents.
Wow, fascinating. So many questions in the chat. I'll try to get to as many as possible. From Homer, we try to keep things as historically based as possible, but on the other hand, this is a really interesting question. I hope it's okay to ask. Homer asks if you could comment on Pope Leo being identified as, mixed race. I believe it's his maternal side, and the implications there. Would he have been considered Black in the Jim Crow South, and other historical figures that have some mixed race heritage? Any thoughts or comment there? I think our audience would really love to hear it.
Yeah, I would say it turns out, if I could say, the Pope and I are of the same generation, and part of what I share that by way of to say that on the one hand, we are born in the so-called one drop rule era, where in many states, one ancestor, even remote in time, of African descent, by law made one Black. I can't say what the law was where the Pope Leo was born. I was born in New York, where the one drop rule was not part of the regime, but it was in many other places. Um, does that mean that we are obliged to see ourselves by way of, the one drop rule or any other kind of state edict about who we are? I think not. And certainly we know too many family stories that diverge from the ways in which the laws of in our case, the 1950s might have regarded us. I tell the story at the end of this book about my own birth certificate, which does not records both of my parents as white. Well, that's not correct, but we might overread or overascribe to something like a birth certificate authority over who we understand ourselves to be, who our families are. So I certainly wouldn't comment on how the Pope sees himself or understood his own family. There's a story there, certainly. And I guess what I would want to allow for is that, yes, what we're seeing now is an official record, birth certificates, marriage licenses, censuses, and more being brought out and telling a version of his family story. There is another version of the family story, and it is the one that is developed within a family, that is passed down generation to generation. Whether he will share the fullness of that story or others in his family will share that, I think we will see. But I just caution folks about over-interpreting his life story and his family story by way of documents that were created by regimes and by people who did not have the full interests of his family in mind.
Wow, fascinating. Thanks so much for that good question and really timely and important answer. Bob asked an interesting question. In a time when there's so much pushback about telling stories that do not fit neatly into traditional silos, why do you feel it is important to tell stories like yours in our classrooms, and what does that bring to our students that enriches us all?
So there's two parts to that question. One is our struggles with our school districts, with our state departments of education, with federal officials, all of whom have strong and varying ideas about what should and should not be discussed in our classrooms. I'm probably not going to comment on that, except to say that to recognize that we are teaching in a thorny and in some circumstances, treacherous times. And so I would never purport to tell Bob or anyone, how to navigate those troubled waters. But I am with you and appreciate the challenges that educators are facing in this moment. I think, though, for families like mine, and families not very much like mine, but who share a complicated past, I think I am learning how powerful it is to have our families affirmed as I'm meeting people in libraries and in classrooms and in bookstores, and folks, if you will, coming out of the shadows, and recounting the fullness of their families, dispensing with shame, dispensing with fear, dispensing with the sense that there is some kind of consequence or retribution to be had. I think turns out to be very important. But it also turns out for me to be very it turns out it's part of what can bind us together as Americans, not because our family stories are all the same, but what we share are the ways in which we come from human experiences in which lines have been crossed and crossed again. I met a young woman who told me, one part of her family was from southern Italy and the other was from central Italy. And this was in her family story as challenging as the story I told about color. I have met, the family on one side, they are Catholics, and the other side, they are Protestants or they are Jews. This is as confounding and as challenging and as much the fabric of family stories as anything. And so this possibility that we might see in one another the challenge of navigating the complexities of culture, of faith, of color, and more, and to recognize that as the essence of an American, truly shared American family story has been illuminating for me. And I'd like to think that it would be illuminating for our students too.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much, Bob, for that great question and answer. Sam says, apologies if I'm not following this correctly, but in the story of Mary, if I understand correctly, you're exploring the story of a white woman who endeavors to pass as a person of color. Do you know how common this was? And can you discuss how this phenomenon can help us reconceptualize the meaning of passing?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. At first, I would say, I think that, in my view, passing is the best word we have for Mary's experience. And yet, I would say it is just inadequate to capture the wholeness of what it means in the United States for a so-called white woman to live her life as a woman of color, to represent herself as a woman of color, and to do so in an effort to protect her family, to protect her children. For Mary and Elijah, if they are exposed, not only is their marriage invalidated by state law, they are vulnerable to the criminal charge of bastardy, the charge of fornication. And so the stakes are high for them each time they are scrutinized or sized up by, say, a census taker. So I want to be clear about that. And I do think I have heard now stories in which the term passing gets used in many contexts, right? For the American immigrant who purges their accent, who changes their family name to pass as a native-born American. On and on, I think that passing, again, is a term we most often associate with Black Americans who live lives as white. But it turns out passing is something that's going on in many families, in many communities, in many households, and frequently it is a strategy for survival.
Wow, fascinating. Really great question and answer again. Adam asked a simple but important question. How do you differentiate between memory and history in this very personal family history? Was that difficult? Can you talk about that process as a descendant and also historian, a historian?
Yeah. Thank you. It is a straightforward question, maybe, but it's not an easy one, and it's an important one because I think I went into this book understanding that I would write like a historian, which is to say that I would do my research, I would weigh the evidence, I would arrive at the best single story that I could tell about this family. But it wasn't too long into the writing that I realized what fascinated me more than getting the story right was understanding why other people told the stories they did. And so this is very much a book about family history as really memory. And that means that in each generation, the story changes. And I came to understand that two things. One, that in each generation, folks are telling the best stories they can, and they are telling the stories they need to tell. And that means sometimes there are parts of the stories that are omitted or elided. There are parts of the stories that are shaved to come to us in one way rather than another. And that there's a kind of truth in that way of telling the story of a family. Perhaps not the truth, for example, of my great-great-grandmother Isabella, who was not a free woman, though that was the story we told. She indeed had been enslaved. But the truth lies in why, in my grandfather's generation, it was risky, it was difficult, it was uncomfortable to tell her story in that way. That out of a protection for their own reputation, and I think as a way of protecting her memory, they elided that part of her story, even though it was an extremely central part of her story. So it is very much a book that wants to honor memory rather than to challenge memory in the ways that I think historians often do. It is a book that wants to capture memory and even to challenge the historian sometimes, as I try to take a piece of memory, even the fantastical, and see what I can do with it. So I have a great grandmother who remembered herself as the granddaughter of John Jacob Astor. Now, you don't need to know much about John Jacob Astor, except that he was said to be the wealthiest man in 19th century America. And nobody in my family ever believed her. But as a historian, I took her seriously. You have to read the book to see how I did. But I think that this exchange between history and memory is central in the book. And I came to believe memory was as important as history in writing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect segue to just mention again that there's links in the chat to get your hands on this great book through bookshop.org. And we really encourage everyone on the call to do so. So many good questions. I'll try to get to a couple more. I'm keeping an eye on time. Carol says, hello, thank you so much for the presentation today. Based on your research for this and your years of research for other works, can you explain the real reason for initiating a census? And to this day, what is the purpose of the census? Was suppressing the vote the main purpose? Why is the threat of imprisonment a necessary accompaniment for the census? An interesting question, one that I hadn't thought too much about, but is most likely important.
Yeah. Hi, Carol, and thank you for that, because, and I can tell Carol has done some important look and critical thinking about the census already. Yes, there is a fine and a penalty associated with so-called false answers on the census, for example. The census is provided for in the Constitution of 1787 as a way of counting Americans to determine the apportionment of representatives in Congress. And we continue to use the census in precisely that way until today. But it has taken on many other purposes. And in the 21st century, it is an instrument, not the only instrument, but an important instrument in social scientific demographic research, and it is used that way. What I discovered in the 1850s was that the census, as it begins to expand to collect names and ages, occupations, languages spoken, and race and color, the census in the mid-19th century is partly an instrument of race science. And Congress is very deliberate in not only including more elaborate categories when it comes to race and color, but to instructing enumerators to be meticulous, because the data is going to be used to test a now long ago outmoded and discredited theory called mulatto degeneracy. The census is going to be used to determine whether so-called hybrid people, or what people we would refer to as mixed race, were in fact defective. Did they live shorter lives? Were they unable to have children, to procreate? And the census officials in Washington are party to the emerging science, pseudoscience of race, and design the instrument to, in part, test that. Mary and Elijah, when they are counted on the census as M for mulatto, are exactly the kinds of subjects, unwittingly, subjects of that kind of experimentation that's happening by way of the US Census.
Wow, fascinating. Fascinating question for sure. Try to get to two more questions, perhaps. Sandra says, or rather asks, does your book or you address address race through DNA ancestry testing? You know, this has kind of become a new industry, cottage industry. Might it challenge or confirm what you wrote? Any thoughts about the new kind of boom in this ancestry testing?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sandra. I have not, and I want to say something about this. I think where we are right now with DNA and ancestry testing, of course, is in the midst of an important moment in the 23andMe arena. Profound questions about who owns that data and to what purposes that data can be put, especially as 23andMe is dissolved by way of bankruptcy. So I'm probably more resolute than ever about not having done DNA. But I want to say why, because there are such wonderful family memoirs that are generated out of the discoveries of that flow from DNA testing and the sharing of data. I felt, and I think I still continue to feel that for me, and in my story, terms like family and especially terms like mother, father, grandfather, and the other monikers, right, that we use to refer to people in our families, my sense is that these things are honorifics. That is to say, that it may be that not everyone with whom we share DNA is a member of our family, even as it might share genetic material in some very intimate way. This is my view, Sandra, and I really wanted to understand my own family through the bonds of kinship, through affection, through commitment, and more. And so there are people in this story with whom I share DNA, I suspect, but upon whom I don't bestow the kind of regard that I do to those who have shared our intimate bonds over time. And that's my way of telling a family story, and it certainly might not be everybody's way of telling that story.
Wow, fascinating. Really important question and answer. I think that I will give G. Chandler Vaughn final word. He asked a really important question, I believe, before I throw it back to Gina for some final thoughts. And the question is this: with your sort of longue durée sense of history, do you believe that these current attempts to delegitimize and essentially erase historical truths of race in the US will, in the long term, the very long term, fail?
Yes. I don't believe that history, including family history, but history more broadly, is a commodity to be owned, to be meted out, to be packaged and controlled by any one faction or quarter in our world. Partly a family story like that one I've told is a testament to how we can know the past, even when nearly all the people in the story I tell were of little to no interest of the state, their interests were antithetical to the state. And yet we're able to recover those histories and more. My field of research generally is African American history. And of course, for most of our national history, African American history was not regarded as a legitimate or worthy subject of research. Our most highly regarded repositories were at best indifferent and if not hostile to African American history. And that has meant that Black history, for example, has grown up in this country largely independent of caretaking by the state or caretaking by prestigious libraries or archives. It's the beginning of the 20th century when the historian Carter Woodson founds the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History to do the work that is not being done in more formal quarters. Woodson establishes the Journal of Negro History, which continues to be published today as the Journal of African American History. Woodson creates Negro History Week, what is today Black History Month. And he and his compatriots do that and a great deal more without the support or the permission or the infrastructure of the state. So do I lament and decry those efforts that would purge any of our past from its place in our archives and our libraries and our museums and more? Yes. Do I believe that those efforts to purge will fail? Yes. Last thing, I have more confidence in Americans than perhaps I should, but I believe certainly when it comes to the kind of history that is the context for the story I tell in The Trouble of Color, in particular the history of slavery, the genie's out of the bottle. Americans know that slavery is a part of our national past. It is regrettable and more, but Americans know this. And I don't think Americans are going to fall for a move. I don't think my students certainly wouldn't fall for that move. And I don't think they're going to fall for it in our museums or in our libraries or anywhere else. That we are much more capable and curious and resilient as Americans than the critics of so-called woke history are allowing for. And I know, for example, the panoply of what goes on in these book breaks, every Sunday, and the audiences that are here to learn all kinds of history, much of which is difficult, much of which is not always beautiful or easily laudatory about our national past, and yet we show up every week here. And so I think that's who we are, and I just don't think Americans are going to fall for, the so-called whitewashing of the past. I don't.
Wow. Well, that's a perfect note to throw things back to Gina. Really perfectly said. Gina, back to you for some final thoughts. Thanks for great questions from the audience, as always.
Yes, thank you so much. And as Ryan had mentioned in the chat, if you'd like to get a copy of the book today, if your question was not answered, you can purchase it today at bookchalk.org, and the affiliate commission we receive supports our programming for history teachers and students. And we hope that you will join us next week when we welcome our friend Garrett Graff and his book, When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day. You can also go online, gilderlerman.org/bookbreaks, to see our archive of more than 250 scholar presentations. And you can also find the Hamilton Education Program, online exhibitions, and so much more. Martha, thank you. It was so wonderful to have you again. Please come back.
Thank you so much, Gina. I look forward to the next time.
All right, have a great day, everyone.